chant that is typically all throughout India chanted to bless any coming together. And I'm going to chant that for us, and it basically says, here we are, we're going to do something important together, and we're praying for harmony of minds and hearts, and don't let us argue. Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavaditamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Shanti is peace, as you may know. This property was just really overgrown, and there was a little place here which we rented for 3 weeks for a meditation retreat, and it was called the Tropical Inn, and it was very disheveled, basically deferred maintenance model for the world. But because of that, we were able to purchase this property for $162,000. But it sounds like a pittance right now, but for us in those days, that was, we didn't have $162,000, and we had never seen $162,000. And every month, I'll never forget, we had a mortgage payment for, I think it was 25 years, $1,585, and every month we asked ourselves, can we do this? We did, of course, but it was only because it was in such rancid shape that we own it. Otherwise, you know, Oprah Winfrey would own it, or somebody like that. So we spent our whole life basically clearing the land, and you're going to see some waterways and waterfalls. Those were all marshes and swamps when we arrived, mostly filled with mature howbush trees. I mean 3 foot in diameter howbush trees. Took us decades to clear all of that and kind of terraform the land and build the gardens. And I myself, in those days, knew nothing at all about plants. What I did know about was bees, because I was the monastery beekeeper. And we kept growing the bees up and increasing them. At the height, we had 3,000 colonies of bees on Kauai Island in 80 different apiary sites, from up in Kauai to Ka Beach. I mean, like every 2 miles, we had an apiary. We sold our honey in 55-gallon drums. We had a honey house in Hanapepe. Sold it in 55-gallon drums, and every month, get this, we sold 30 of those drums to Orohui Bakery in Honolulu. They really loved especially our Kiawe honey, because Kiawe honey, if you've ever had it, it's like, what's it like? It's like the brandy of honey, something like that. But we sold the bees when the Apple computer came out in 1984 or 85, and we adopted them and began doing some high-end computer work here. And we couldn't do both. My team was trying to do both bees and our publishing, and we found out we couldn't do both, and so we sold the bees. And after the bees were gone, I looked around and I realized that I had a little time on my hands, and I had a little bit of knowledge about plants from the bees' point of view. So I had to learn a little bit in order to make them happy, right? And so I built on that knowledge in just doing the garden. The garden, as you will see, is I don't know what to call it. Call it a chaos garden or maybe a helter-skelter garden. The idea of the garden originally was to not make it look man-made too much, to not engineer it, but to make it look like you just found it. Like it just happened by itself. And of course, it didn't just happen by itself. Everything you see, except maybe a dozen trees like that banyan tree and a couple of large trees, everything that you're going to see in the next couple of hours, we put in the ground. And not only that, for those of you who actually do gardening, I put 50 things in the ground for every 4 things that you're going to see. And the others are all died and went to botanical heaven. So, and it's been a real love for me, and a balance of my life. My real job is in the publishing world. We do a world-class magazine called Hinduism Today, and you're going to visit the office where my team does this. They're not there today because this is a retreat day. They're off doing other things. But we publish books on Hindu culture and philosophy and theology. We do this magazine, goes to 61 countries in the world, and do website. We have a rather massive website and things like that. This issue, I'm going to point it out because it's plant material. So I always wanted to do an issue on the rudraksha bead. For those who don't know, this bead here is considered sacred in India. Heliocarpus genitris is the botanical name, and it's famous in India and Nepal. And I always wanted to do a full article on it because we have a forest that you're going to see. It's the only sacred rudraksha forest in the Western world. And so I hired a team from Kathmandu to do this story, a photographer and a journalist, and they flew to the valley where Nepal grows most of its rudrakshas. And interestingly enough, just tomorrow in Honolulu, there's a Korean Airlines box for me of 18 seedlings of Nepalese rudrakshas coming to add to the garden, because their beets are a little different than the ones that we grow, and so I'm adding them to our collection. This is a fascinating story, a really rich story with lots of little cool details, like 1/6 of the gross national product of the country of Nepal is the sale of this bead to China. 1/6. Isn't that astonishing? So we did the full story. I put a QR code there. If you wanted to read the whole story online, you could just take a picture of the QR code and that would take you to the story. It's kind of cool. So I asked, for example, Nikki Tupp, our journalist, I said, when you're in the place where they do this, they auction off the beads every year. And the Chinese send 350 buyers to this valley who take up all of the accommodations for 2 months, and they negotiate for the best beads in the world. And they're outbidding all of the Indians right now. The Chinese are. I said, Nikki, find out for me, how much was the most expensive bead ever sold at auction? Because if you go to our little gift shop, if you have an ordinary bead, it's like $5. If you have a certain bead, it's like 101. And if you have a really, really rare one, it's $1,000 for a bead. So I said, how much? So get this. The most expensive bead auctioned to the Chinese was $85,000 US. So I tell the young monks that money does grow on trees.
What makes one more special than another?
It's the facets. They call them faces or mukhi in Sanskrit. Most of them have 5 little divisions. And actually each of these beads, these are all 5. And that's what our forest mostly produces. There's 5 seeds in one bead. So some of the facets you can get, like if you get 2 facets, that's like really rare. This one that sold for $85,000 had 33 facets, which never happened before or since. But that's the singular difference, is the number of facets. Go figure. So, there are, I should probably say the basics. There's 20 monks living here from 5 different countries. We have 70 acres of land on this side of the river that you're going to see. Today you're going to probably see half of that, or maybe a little more when we drive around. And we have 312 acres on the other side of the river where we grow mostly hardwood trees. We also grow some disease-free acacia koa, special genetically engineered koa that doesn't die when certain fungi, I guess, come through. And we have specimen trees over there also. It's like an agricultural endowment for monks of the future. So that the idea that we had when we started this years ago, about 25 years ago, was monks of the future, we wait 60 years and they can have, you know, millions of dollars worth of rare hardwoods as they don't have to go and beg for money anymore.
You design that waterfall as well?
I don't have that kind of skill set.
God designed that.
Yeah.
Wow, beautiful.
Yeah, I'd say this is quite inspirational.
is either turtle plant or
Okay.
inch plant.
Inch plant, yeah.
Inch plant. And if anyone wants to grab a little piece of this,
Oh,
it grows like crazy. I mean, it's winter now, but
yeah.
who wants? Gallon pot maybe 30 years ago for $19. And it grew up. There's a bigger one there, and then I put a smaller one here so more people could see it. So this plant went on auction in Sydney, Australia last May, and the winning bid was 24,000 US dollars
What?
for a plant in a pot.
Wow.
My theory is that when COVID came, all these super mega billionaires worked from their mansions and looked around the garden and said, you know what, I'm going to be here all day. I'm going to make this worthy. And they sent out their landscape architects with no budget to buy the best plants in the world. And they started buying them like crazy and driving the price up. If you go on eBay now, you can find hundreds of plants that are selling for $4,000, $5,000,
Yep.
$6,000 for a single plant in a pot. These are plants that 20, 30 years ago you'd pay $20 for. My theory is that things are going to all go back to normal eventually. They're not going to be able to keep that level of and they've put me out of the market. All overgrown, and the waterways were a marsh. And so we brought in again some excavators, we dug out the ponds. I brought these giant black boulders from Eli Quarry, which was quite a project back in the day, because this kind of rock we don't find here on this property. And that's a lot of them too. Yeah, and a couple of them are so big that, one truck.
Do you say LA?
Eli? Yeah, they have a quarry.
Yeah.
So usually they take these boulders and grind them up and make gravel for roads.
Yeah, right.
So we would go out there and pick the pretty ones and say, don't crush this one, sell it to me instead. One is this temple has donors all over the world, and they give us about $75,000 or $80,000 a month for the temple. And they've been doing that for 33 years.
Wow.
To create it. And at the same time, our guru who founded it said for every dollar that comes in, 50 cents goes into an endowment, and 50 cents goes into stone and salaries and shipping and that. So we now have an endowment. It's untouchable. It's not a quasi-endowment. It's a real endowment worth $9 million. It just sits there. And that revenue, the income from that $9 million, is now paying for the monthly salary of the priest that you're going to meet in a minute, and the gardening and all of that. So the endowment will perpetually support the temple. That's just the temple.
Yeah.
Then another revenue stream is our publications, which is small by comparison, and we don't make even a penny, and that's not our intent. We bring in from advertisers and subscribers about $40,000 a month, and we spend about $39,500 a month. And if we break even, that's a happy day for ourselves. But for orphanages in India, and old people's homes, and ashrams, and we fund about 85 institutions through those endowments. And then people who are interested in it, say there's a cow sanctuary that has an endowment, then people who love cows will give to that endowment. That's how it works. All of the complexity of the garden away from the temple, so that the temple would take center place. I had earlier visions that had a lot of plants here that would not have been happy. So this is kind of a very austere setting for this glorious sculpture. Well, the real design is designed by architects 1,000 years ago in the Chola Empire of South India. Our tweaking of those traditional designs is done by a master builder called Ganapati Stapati. And you're going to see his statue in a minute. He's India's greatest architect. I don't know how we ever found him. And he became our designer, and he came here many times during his life. He's no longer alive. And one time we had to fly him to Kauai when we were getting a building permit, because the building department was looking at the plans and they said, no, you can't build this. Where's the steel? Where's the girders? And there's not a piece of steel in this temple, and that's part of Indian tradition. So we flew him from India, and for 3 days he sat down in a conference room with the engineers in Lahui, explaining how this temple could be safe, because they were trained in Western engineering, and they expected stainless steel things with bolts and rebar, and there's not a piece of rebar in any part of this, even the foundation. And after 3 days, he finally convinced them, and their summary was, oh, I get it. It's a gravity building.
Okay, simplified.
Yeah.
And ones just like it have been standing for 1,000 years.
And, well, and he told them, and he actually took pictures with him of temples in India that were built in this style that were built 5,000 years ago, still standing.
They're still there.
And this is going to be the only building on Kauai that you see today that 1,000 years from today is still here. Every other building, every one of them is going to be gone. It's six-sided, perfectly six-sided and pointed, but it's not carved. It was made that way inside the cave in the earth, the way crystals form, right? And they say it takes about, I was told, 50 or 60 million years to create a crystal of that scale. And I had an interesting experience one year. We kept it in that temple until last March. And so I was studying Sanskrit chanting at the time, and I had an old-fashioned tape recorder, you know, this kind.
Reel to reel.
Yeah, well, I had a little cassette, battery-operated tape recorder, cheap one, but I was learning Sanskrit chant with that. While I was listening to the chant, I walked by the crystal, maybe this close to the crystal, and my tape recorder started playing Hawaiian radio stations. I could not believe it. Then I realized later that because it's so big, it had the equivalent effect on the machinery as if a crystal was embedded, which is how you make a radio, right? So instead of a little crystal inside the radio, I had a big crystal that made a tape recorder play music. And he's standing there sharing his vision with the architect, Ganapati Stabari. The architect has the building plans under his left arm, and he's addressing the guru in a very traditional Indian way. This is called a gesture of humility, and that's how, if you're talking to a king or a guru, that's how you do it. It's interesting. And I put a rock from the same quarry as the temple before they got their hands on it, so that people could see the roughness. And then Gurudeva wanted it to be a workshop to show people in the future that the temple wasn't built with a 3D printer, but was in fact hand carved. And so we show the technology over here. This Shopi is heating up the chisels to red hot in a little forge, and he hands the hot chisels to this man, who holds them with a tong and with a hammer on a steel brick, forms the tip again, makes the tip sharp again. And that is mild steel, which is important because it's easy to control, apparently. But that also means that against the hard rock, the chisel will get dull in about 4 minutes. Yeah. So every 4 minutes, he needs a newly sharpened chisel. So chisel sharpening was a big part of building this temple. That's shown there. And then they're making the rock shorter using the tools. These are the only two tools used, a hammer and a chisel. There's different kinds of chisels, but basically chisels. And then this is an architect who's it's called the marking Shilpi. He's the kind of the artist of the group, who, with a little red dyed bamboo stylus, he marks the designs, and then the less artistic but more functional Shilpis do the carving. And then he'll mark, and then he'll carve, and then mark, and then carve, and that's how it progresses. And over there, they're moving the stone in their way with the 2 o'o bars. And so part of the idea that Gurudeva had, which I love, is just like in America, rich people take credit for everything. So they'll have a university built, or a skyscraper, and then they'll send all of the people who built it away with nice checks and say, look what I did. And temples in India were like that. The king would bring in 5,000 or 10,000 workers for a decade. They would work. They'd give him 100 rupees, a pat on the back, and send them back, and then turn to the media and say, look what I did. And so whenever you look in the history book, you see the name of the king. And Gurudeva wanted the people that actually crafted the temple to be honored. And this is, to our knowledge, in Hindu tradition, this is the only workshop that does that anywhere in the world. And they're gifted. I mean, look at this. This is a rock.
Completely.
This is a 9-foot long rock.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, when I first saw it, I had new neurons growing in my brain. I thought it was metal.
Oh.